Good evening from Somnolent Conspiracies, where we greet the night with a magnifying glass and a little mercy for what it reveals. Cairo after dark moves like a river that refuses to be mapped. Horns like distant brass, minarets keeping time, hotel lobbies shining as if gold could forgive. Our case begins in a mid-tier hotel off Talat Harb Street. Patterned carpet, lemon polish, a wall mirror with a hairline fracture like a vein. The guest in 402, an academic from Alexandria, reported something most managers would fire you for writing down. When she looked into the mirror at 10:11 p.m., she saw the same room 13 minutes from now. The television displayed a soccer score not yet final. The curtains were half open, though hers were closed. And in that reflection, a man lay on the carpet, throat cut. There was no body in the actual room. Not yet. Our narrator is Mina Darras, a Cairo crime scene photographer who used to shoot weddings and learned to focus while everybody else blinked. The hotel manager is Samir Abdelnour, who knows how to keep police out of TripAdvisor. The academic, Dr. Layla Khoury, studies ancient glass and speaks about it as if it remembers. Inspector Farouk arrives with a patience that hides an appetite for facts. The mirror offers an alibi to the future and a dare to the present. If 13 minutes can be borrowed, someone will spend them. We will test where the electricity hums, where the corridor lens is misaligned, where a pane of glass can act like a clock if you teach it to. We will watch Cairo's lights write on ceilings and men's faces and one polished blade. Perhaps the mirror is only a trick of optics. Perhaps it knows a habit of time. Either way, we will choose the kind of truth you can put in a file. Breathe with me. The first image is about to arrive. Part 1, the mirror that runs 13 minutes ahead. I have learned to count a room by the way it remembers light. Weddings taught me that. You wait for the second when the veil stops trembling and the groom forgets to breathe. You press the shutter and the world gives you a truth it cannot hold for long. Room 402 gave another kind of truth. Kept one that had not happened yet. The hotel was the sort that polished brass as if it were a promise. Off Talat Harb Street, the lobby smelled of lemon and an old argument between cigarettes and perfume. The manager, Samir Abdelnour, walked me through the corridor with a key in his palm and caution in his shoulders. He had called me because a guest had seen something and he wanted someone who could look without adding panic to the bill. The door to 402 opened on patterned carpet and a mirror that took up most of the wall opposite the bed. A hairline fracture climbed the glass from the bottom corner to the height of a wrist. It looked like a vein that had learned to behave. Dr. Layla Khoury stood near it with a notebook. She had the precise stillness of someone who speaks to old objects and expects them to answer eventually. Inspector Farouk arrived with 2 constables and a calm that might have been a method or a habit. Samir gave me the situation again. At 10:11 p.m., the guest had looked into the mirror and seen the same room, but 13 minutes from now. The television in the reflection displayed a score that was not yet final. The curtains in the reflection were half open while the real curtains hung fully closed. A man lay on the carpet in the reflection with his throat cut. There had been no body in the actual room. I set my tripod in 3 positions. 1 to capture the bed and the mirror together. 1 to take a direct image of the glass. 1 higher to track the ceiling light and the corner where mirrors like to keep their secrets. I synced the camera timecode to Cairo time using the constable's radio and Dr. Khoury's phone. Inspector Farouk had both devices photographed against a clock in the lobby. His proof that we were not inventing a minute to suit ourselves. I asked the room to be quiet. Cameras hear differently when the air is still. The television showed a taped match and a live scroll of a league table down the side. The curtains were drawn. On the bedside table, someone had left a glass ring of water with a seed of dust at the bottom. The mirror held its ordinary obedience. I photographed it anyway. It is useful to know what a thing looks like when it has nothing to say. At 10:09 by my camera, I took a frame every 15 seconds. The constable read the time aloud. 10:10. 10:10 and 15, 10:10 and 30, 10:10 and 45. The mirror gave us what we already knew. The carpet, the bed, the thin line of crack like a warning made decorative. At 10:11 the mirror changed. It did not blink or shimmer. simply chose a different truth. The curtains in the reflection were now half open. The television in the reflection carried a late goal, a surge of sound and color that did not exist in the room with us. In the reflection, a man lay on the carpet near the foot of the bed. He was on his side facing away from the glass. I saw an angle of jaw, the collar of a dark shirt, a hand that seemed to have reached for something and stopped. On the carpet near his throat was a smear that could have been a shadow if shadows had weight. Behind me, the real curtains remained closed. The television continued its quiet scroll toward a future it had not reached. The carpet was empty. Air went out of the room in a soft, unkind way. I pressed the shutter again and again. I described what was visible as I worked, not for drama, only for the record. Inspector Farouk moved to the side of the mirror and stood where the man would have lain if the reflection were a window. He said nothing. He did not need to. He had the look of a man who had waited for wars to end by counting the seconds between shells. Dr. Khoury lifted her phone and photographed the reflection beside my frames. She checked the corner seam of the glass where silver meets wood. She said the backing was older than the hotel by at least a century. Tin and mercury. She said it with affection, then apologized for being herself in a room where someone might be about to die. At 10:12, my camera captured the reflection of the bed with the indentation of weight. The real bed remained smooth. At 10:13, the television score in the reflection changed to a final number. In the real room, the number lagged behind as if it had to walk a slower street to reach us. The inspector asked the constable to radio the desk and place the floor under a soft lockdown. No fire alarms, no doors chained, nothing that would startle the guests. He took a strip of clean tape from his pocket and sealed the door latch so he would know the first time it broke its own promise. He had the sensibility of a man who makes evidence walk by its own feet. At 10:24, Samir brought us corridor footage from the hotel's CCTV. We watched the earlier minutes while my camera continued to eat time. On the screen, a man passed the lens on his way toward the rooms. He wore a jacket that hung like someone else's and a ring on his right hand that made the light pause. Lapis lazuli, I thought, because I had shot a wedding once where the mother of the bride would not let go of her hand until we had described the ring correctly. The timestamp on the footage read 10:24. In the window of the playback, we did not see the man at 10:11. The mirror held its image steady as we compared points. The half-drawn curtains in the reflection matched the corridor light one might expect if a door had opened and someone had chosen to look out. The figure on the carpet did not move. He was not a witness. He was a problem the room was keeping for us. I tried a simple test. I stood in the place where the reflected man lay and raised my hand. The mirror refused to show me. It was loyal to its own moment. I photographed my empty reach anyway, then photographed the mirror saying no. At 10:24 and a few seconds, the reflection faded to match the present. The curtains in the glass drifted until they aligned with the real ones. The score on the reflected television dissolved into the same unfinished number that stood before us. The carpet was once again clean in both worlds. It was as if the mirror had paid a debt and closed its ledger. We replayed the frames. My stills told us the shift had lasted exactly 13 minutes. The reflection began at 10:11 and ended at 10:24. The inspector wrote it down in two places, then asked me to say it aloud while the constable filmed me saying it. He believed in redundant truths. Samir asked if we could call it a trick. He sounded like a man who loved his hotel more than it deserved him. I said that a trick is a promise to lie and then to stop lying. This had the feel of a mechanism that had been taught to think in only one direction. It did not feel supernatural. It felt like a plan that had grown a superstition the way a pipe grows a stain. The inspector ordered the room sealed, not because he wanted to make a theater of it, but because he knew the worst thing we could do was to prove a miracle and then let it work on its own audience. He sent one constable to hold the corridor and another to take the guest list for the entire floor. He asked the desk to keep the bar receipts warm. People tell the truth to bartenders because they mistake the glass for a friend. Dr. Khoury stood close to the mirror and breathed on one corner. The fog of her breath made a soft oval that revealed a thumbprint in the silvering. Not fresh. It did not belong to any of us. She wrote down where it was as if she were mapping a star. I asked for the door logs. Hotels keep a thought of every move their doors make. The manager looked reluctant, then nodded and sent for the file. We learned nothing new yet, but we would. Doors fall in love with their own stories. You only have to listen well. We stood together in the quiet and let the room return to the hour that belonged to it. I kept photographing. The inspector kept writing down the names of things as if names could keep them honest. Samir kept rubbing an invisible mark on the dresser with the corner of his handkerchief. Dr. Khoury watched the glass as if it might speak again if we were kind. When we left the room, the tape on the latch kept its neat line. The constable took his position outside as if a straight back could hold back fate. In the lift, the inspector said we would try to change the next reflection before it arrived. If the future could be taught, perhaps it could be taught to behave. We walked past the lobby where the lemon scent failed to hide 1,000 old stories. Cairo leaned its shoulder against the glass doors and looked in at us. The city does not care what you think about time. It only asks if you will be ready when it arrives. Part 2: Intervention that fails to stick. We chose a time the way surgeons choose a knife. The mirror had given us its number, 11:11. The inspector did not like portents, so he called it the next scheduled interval. He requested that the hotel keep the floor calm and that the bar stop pouring spirits 10 minutes early. He wanted sober witnesses and clean clocks. We returned to room 402 at 10:54. The constable at the door lifted the tape on the latch and resealed it after we entered. I checked the tripod positions and the interval timer. I set the camera to 1 frame every 5 seconds and a separate recording for continuous video. Redundant truths again. I am not religious about much, but the shutter counting down a lie makes a kind of liturgy. The room had the careful quiet of a stage before the curtain rises. The carpet remembered the weight of our earlier questions and pretended it did not. The glass held our reflections with the modesty of a servant who knows all the secrets and keeps them stored behind the eyes. Dr. Khoury stood with her notebook and her gloves. She had powdered the thumbprint oval she had found. The powder did not lift anything usable, but it recorded the location like chalk around a shadow. 10:58, the mirror changed. The shift arrived with the same refusal of spectacle. 1 frame showed our room. The next frame showed a room that was ours 13 minutes ahead and not ours at all. The curtains in the reflection were half open to the city lights. The television in the reflection was dark. I had left our television on and turned the volume higher as a marker. In the glass, it looked as if someone had pulled the plug from a socket no one could see. On the carpet, in the reflection, lay the same man. This time his face was angled just enough to show the open mouth where no breath moved. There was a dark sweep near his throat, not a pool but an arc. I felt it before I knew it. The sweep curved the wrong way for a fall. It curved like a gesture the air had tried to refuse. We spoke less than we had in the first test. The inspector stood near the door with his watch in his palm. He said to proceed. I went to the curtains. In our world they were closed. In the reflection they were half drawn. I gripped the fabric and pulled them all the way open. The city arrived in the window like a promise of normal life. Headlights moved down Talat Harb Street. Minarets kept time silently. The mirror did not care. Its curtains remained half open as if they were painted onto the glass. I took a breath that did not help, then crossed to the television. I raised the volume a notch. The commentator in our room lifted his voice over a replay that promised a goal not yet confirmed. In the reflection, the television stayed black. The screen looked thick, as if it were holding its own night. The inspector spoke to the constable in the corridor through the closed door. A soft exchange to confirm the hallway remained empty. He asked Samir to bring up the door logs as soon as the desk could print them. Samir left to fetch them and returned within 2 minutes, stiff with the effort of not running. I went down on one knee where the reflection showed the blood arc. My hand hovered over our clean carpet. I did not touch it. The room smelled of lemon polish and old air. Then a thin iron scent rose as if someone had dragged a key through a puddle almost too small to see. The smell did not match the sight. Our carpet remained unmarked. I stood and sprayed a light mist of the luminol swab at the distance the manual recommends for a surface test. The blue would have bloomed if hemoglobin had been present. The carpet gave me nothing. Not a dot. The reflection kept its arc without a blush. At 11:09 by my camera, the house telephone rang. The sound was small and old-fashioned, as if the hotel's bones remembered an earlier life. The inspector answered. There was breathing on the line and the faint traveling echo of a nearby television. Before he could speak, the caller hung up. The phone screen did not log a room number. Samir said the system tied calls to the main desk for privacy. The desk had seen no call. The inspector set the receiver down gently as if it might bruise. The door latch sensor chimed in a tiny mechanical way. It was the sound of a refrigerator learning its own mind. Samir looked at the printed log. He frowned and turned the page as if a different sheet might correct the insult. The entry read 11:10. Open. Close. No keycard number attached. He showed it to the inspector. The inspector showed it to my camera as if he were presenting a witness. We stood very still at 11:10 and 30 seconds. It is one thing to count down to a birth. It is another to count down to a death and try to change the noun at the last second. In the mirror, the curtains hung in their half position like a breath never finished. The television in the reflection was a square of absence. The man on the carpet did not move. His hand, the one nearer the camera, had a way of curling that was nearly human and nearly a clock hand pointing to nothing. At 11:11, the television in our room clicked. The screen went to black. I had not touched it. Samir crossed to the wall panel and checked the breaker list. The small red indicator for room 402 had tripped. Not the main circuit. Not the hall. Only this room. He reset it. The indicator popped back to red without the courtesy of delay. He swore under his breath, then apologized to no one in particular. The curtains in our room shifted. I had left them fully open. A draft did not move them. The air conditioner did not run. The fabric slid inward as if drawn by a quiet hand behind the wall. I grabbed the edge. It resisted with the polite insistence of a machine that has been told to be gentle with people. The inspector took hold with me. We pulled them open again. In the mirror, the curtains remained half closed, unbothered by our effort. The iron sense strengthened and then thinned, like a thought the room was trying to have and failing to complete. I checked the luminol again. The carpet stayed honest. I took stills of the honest carpet and the dishonest glass, then filmed both together until the timestamp reached 11:12. A movement crossed the reflection. It was not the man. It was a neat, gloved hand entering from the right edge of the frame. The glove was dark and had a seam like a healed scar along the wrist. The hand carried a folding knife with a narrow blade. The blade opened with a little flare that caught imaginary light. The hand made the cut in a gesture easy to draw. The arc on the carpet widened by a degree as if a painter had returned to touch up a stroke. There was no hand in our room. There was only the four of us holding the air still. The inspector did not look away from the glass. He watched the cut the way a doctor watches a symbol on a monitor. The constable's breathing thickened. Samir pressed a knuckle into his own palm as if it were a charm. At 11:13, the reflection shifted again. The curtains in the glass drifted toward the position we held in our world. The television in the glass remained dead for a few extra seconds, then returned to life behind its own delay. The arc on the carpet softened into an ordinary shadow. The man did not get up. He did not dissolve. He became the absence that follows a story you no longer tell. We stood among our honest things and listened to the hotel settle. The inspector said that the reflection resisted superficial edits. He said it in the calm of a man who chooses the name of a storm before it reaches the harbor. He turned to me. Find the path that brings another room into this glass. He did not need to say more. I had already felt it in the way the reflection handled light that did not belong to us. The television had gone black in a manner too complete for a simple power loss. The curtains had held their own idea against our hands. Someone had taught this mirror to keep two rooms at once and to prefer the one that followed a script. We packed the tripod and left the room as it was. The tape on the latch made its neat line again when we went out. The constable took his post. Samir promised the corridor to our use as long as we needed it. The inspector told him to keep the maintenance master key ready. We would not break anything we did not have to break. The hotel had suffered enough truths for one night. In the lift, the city looked up at us through the numbers as they counted. The inspector asked Dr. Khoury what the inside of an old mirror looks like when it refuses to be only a mirror. She said that it looks like a place where light forgets which way to travel. We went to ask the wall behind the glass if it had learned any new roads. Part 3, the corridor lens. The wall gave way like a lie caught on a nail. Samir brought the maintenance master key, and the inspector signed a short note in the hotel log with the hour and the room number. We moved the dresser and the bedside table as one unit. The mirror hung in its frame with a weight that seemed honest until you felt the draft. Cold air pushed at my wrist from the seam where would met plaster. Samir frowned as if disappointed with his own building. He reached up, found the little cap that was not a cap but a painted hinge, and lifted. The frame tilted. Together we eased it out. Behind the mirror was not solid wall but a dark throat of space. The cavity was the width of the frame and ran up and down well beyond the height of a person. Wooden braces crisscrossed like ribs. Cabling lay along one side in a patient bundle, the way a stagehand coils a line who expects to need it again. The smell came first. Not dust, not mouse, not mold. Myrrh. Very faint. A sweetness that belonged more at a threshold than in a hotel wall. Dr. Khoury turned her head the way a violinist leans toward the note a string remembers. She named it without theatrics. Myrrh, she said. Lobby incense for the high-fee check-in. She had noticed it when we first arrived. Now it had a direction. A lens sat in the cavity on a swing arm, a round eye the size of a teacup. The metal collar that held it had the same myrrh trace under the maintenance grit. I photographed the collar, the dust, the 9 screws that had been turned with more care than the rest. The inspector pointed to a second glass at a shallow angle set just behind the frame. Not a mirror in the everyday sense. A half-silvered pane. If you aimed light from the cavity into the back of the glass, you could lay an image over whatever the room itself offered. It would be faint, a ghost over a body, unless you taught the body to get out of the way. The swing arm carried a thin cable that led up the cavity and then to the right, where the wall opened into a maintenance shaft. I set my camera to video and clipped a small torch to the hot shoe. We followed the cable along the shaft to a hatch that had learned to be invisible by pretending to be a list of fire regulations. Samir undid the latch with the confidence of a man who knows the backbones of his building better than his own. The hatch opened onto a service corridor that ran between the back walls of the even-numbered rooms and the elevator shaft. Across the shaft, through the metal lattice, we could see another hatch. When the inspector lifted his torch, it flashed against another half-silvered pane set behind the mirror of room 404. We had found the other eye. We took the stairs down one flight and then up another to test the line of sight. In the shaft, the air hummed with the little electrical negotiations that keep hotels polite. The inspector held the torch at shoulder height, and I looked back through the cavity of 402. The half-silvered pane collected the light and made a low-wattage version of the inspector's hand appear on our glass like a hesitant blessing. We were drawing an outline, not yet the picture, but the shape matched the feeling that had sat in the room like a fifth guest. The mirror could be forced to prefer a second scene that mimicked our own, could be taught to love a false twin. Room 404 accepted Samir's key without ceremony. The bed was made with crisp corners, as if a correction had just been applied to the idea of sleep. The curtains were neat, the television idle. A full-length mirror leaned against the wall near the window, still wrapped in brown paper at the edges. Its invoice lay tucked behind it. El Nasser Props and Events, the kind of company that outfits weddings, corporate stages, variety shows, and the strange small acts that prefer hotel ballrooms to theaters. A portable scrim sat folded behind the curtain, a translucent fabric on an aluminum frame. The upper edge showed a smear the color of watered wine. Stage blood dries with a little gloss that lingers even when it is rubbed thin. Near it, a few duller dots had browned into the fabric in a way that spoke less of drama and more of the human body. I photographed both. I photographed the window frame, which was sanded down in one section as if someone had adjusted the fit to make pulling curtains feel smooth on cue. The mirror on the wall here did not hide a cavity, presented only itself. The cavity lay behind the opposite wall, exactly where the mirrored twin of 402 would expect it to be. We opened the hatch in 404 and stepped into the same service corridor, now looking across at the back of 402. The swing arm lens in our room's cavity faced us like a compass needle that had finally found its field. I set the camera on a clamp so that it could look through the half-silvered pane in 402 while I performed in 404. We did not have actors or a script. We had a room and geometry. That is often enough. First, we tested the television. Samir powered the set in 404 and tuned it to the same channel as 402. The picture lagged. One channel carries its own barrage of delays. The hotel's distribution system adds another. On top of that, the set in 404 had been configured to buffer the stream, probably to make transitions look smooth on the conference floor. We timed the mismatch with the same redundant care as before. With the half-silvered pane collecting the image from the cavity, 404's television arrived on the glass of 402 at a sweet delay that hovered near 13 minutes. It was not accident. It was a dial someone had turned until the numbers made a superstition. The buffer told the rest. We tested the curtains next. The scrim in 404, when lit from behind, gave the half-drawn look we had seen. It is an old trick that every photographer learns and then forgets to admire. Light a thin fabric at an angle and it becomes a memory of itself. In the glass of 402, the scrim made an almost perfect imitation of half-open curtains where ours were drawn tight. A servo would have been cleaner, but a scrim knows how to work for cheap. The inspector stood with his hands behind his back and watched as if he were in a classroom and the experiment had just stepped out of the textbook. He asked me to adjust the swing arm back and forth while he viewed from 402. At a tenth of a turn, the ghost brightened to nearly the strength of the room. At a quarter turn, it disappeared into the background like a doubt a person decides they can live with. A line of tape on the arm marked the position that delivered the illusion at its most persuasive. The tape had the kind of sticky that comes from experience rather than impatience. The lens collar wore fingerprints in the dust that had a subtle polish at the edges. The polish carried the same scent as the air in the cavity. I shot the collar, the smears, the small flake of blue caught in one screw head. Blue like a lapis field under a lamp in a jewelry shop. Not a stone, just the idea of one. But once an idea finds a rhyme, it rarely leaves the chorus. We logged the delay more precisely. The buffer in 404 added just under 1 minute. The hotel distribution line added one more. The cavity's relay and the half-silvered pane, with their physical path and minor processing, moved us forward another 11. The sum made a superstition clean enough to sell. 13 minutes. A future declared not by prophecy but by a series of bureaucratic pauses and the love of an even lie. I asked for a blanket, a spray bottle, and a handful of paper confetti from the banquet supply closet. The inspector raised an eyebrow but said nothing. In 404, with the camera looking through the cavity to 402, I had Samir mist the air above the scrim while I shook out the blanket. The fine droplets caught the torch and became a sheet of brightness that read as curtain in the glass. When the droplets settled, the curtain in the glass lifted. Light makes fools of our certainty. If you give it texture, it will tell any story you ask. We were close enough now that the floor itself began to whisper names. Room 404 was booked to a man whose check-in photograph showed a right hand wearing a ring that could persuade a camera to look at it twice. Kareem Haddad. Paperwork called him a consultant. The hotel staff called him a fixer for shipments that needed a friend at customs. His bar receipt told us his confidence loosened before midnight most nights and returned with the bill. The housekeeper's note mentioned a full-length mirror delivered earlier in the day. I checked the invoice again and ran my finger along the edge where tape caught dust. There, under the tape, a flake of dark red clung to the wood. It had the matte of stage blood rather than the gloss of the real kind, but a forensic light will not flatter your first guess. I bagged the flake and wrote the time. In the corner behind the curtain, I found a small motor clamped to the rod. Not much, just enough torque to pull the fabric a hand's breadth. The cord dropped through a drilled hole to the cavity. A toggle switch rested where a person standing behind the half-silvered pane could press it without looking. I filmed the path, the switch, the hole, the clean sawdust hiding under the skirting board. The room had been taught to take orders from hands that did not wish to be seen. We returned to 402 and reseated the mirror in its frame. I left the camera watching the glass while Samir pulled the toggle in the cavity once. In the reflection, the curtain slid toward half-closed. He flipped the toggle back. The curtains in the glass did not change. They remained in the position the script preferred. The buffer and relay held the choice like a breath in a chest that refused to exhale. We stood in the hush between a problem and its name. The inspector read back the elements we could now swear to. A half-silvered pane behind the mirror of 402. A swing arm lens in the cavity aimed across the shaft toward 404. A delay chain that, when added to the house feed and the television buffer in 404, landed a picture on 402 approximately 13 minutes ahead. A scrim, a curtain motor, and a simple switch to fix the look. Someone had built a small theater in the walls. The mirror made a soft line between the pieces. The lens collar wore it like a private blessing. The smell belonged to the lobby's high fee check-in desk, not to the maintenance corridor. Whoever adjusted the apparatus did not come from housekeeping with a bundle of rags and a hurry. They came from a place in the hotel where polish and ritual met money. The inspector asked the question that had been waiting in the corner. If 404 provided the stage and 402 the audience, who wrote the script and who had the keys to the lights? We had a name on the door of 404. We did not yet have the hand that changed the dial on the buffer or the person who said when to make the cut. Before we sealed the cavity again, I took one last still of the half-silvered pane from the side. It showed our faces bent at an angle into their own doubles. The glass gave us back a version of ourselves that arrived a fraction of a second out of phase. It was enough to feel like memory. We replaced the mirror and smoothed the frame with care. The room looked ordinary again, which is the most dangerous way a room can look. The inspector told the constable to note any movement near 404 and to keep the corridor clear. He did not want an audience for the theater that had just been revealed. He gave the order as if he were speaking to the air ducts. Prepare for a controlled run. If the mirror is a window dressed as a prophecy, we will decide what it sees next. The city outside shook its night loose against the windows and moved on. We stayed with our glass and our machine and the small faith that follows a measured lie. Part 4, The Guest with the Lapis Ring. The first time I saw Karim Haddad, he was a reflection before he was a man. The corridor camera had caught him at 10:24, walking as if the carpet were a contract. Up close, he had a face that had studied mirrors until the mirrors gave up and agreed. The ring on his right hand was a square of blue that convinced the hotel lights to treat it like a sky. We waited until the bar stopped pouring and the lobby lost the hour's noise. The inspector preferred to meet people when their armor had cooled. Samir led us through a service door to the back stair that opened near the bar. The way staff move when they hope to see without being seen. The bartender knew the inspector in the way men who work nights know each other. He had the look of someone who counts money by its weight. He pointed to a stool 2 seats from the end. He drank there, the bartender said. Single malt, 2 fingers, 1 cube. Talked on the phone, not much. Closed his tab at 22:58. Then he left with the kind of neutrality that means a man expects the world to hold his place. The receipt matched the time. The signature rolled across the paper like a habit. We stepped out to the corridor and followed the camera's sightline toward the rooms. The constable at 404 straightened without fuss and said nothing had passed. The tape on the latch of 402 held its clean line. We knocked at 404. The door opened to a sliver and then wider, the way a man opens a door when he already knows who is there and does not know yet what they want. Karim Haddad wore a soft jacket with the shoulders eased by a tailor more patient than anyone has a right to be. The ring on his right hand was lapis lazuli, cut in a rectangle and set in a thick band. The pigment had the deep that belongs to honest stone. I had seen lapis in wedding bracelets and museum cases. In a ring, it becomes a stage light that does not need electricity. He looked at the inspector, then at me, then at Samir. He chose his tone like a person choosing which room to enter. Polite first, then bored, then something that could be mistaken for injured pride if you did not know how men protect their money. Inspector Farouk introduced us and explained the situation with the calm that suggests the situation will explain itself if it is left alone long enough. He asked to see the room. Karim stepped aside with the reluctance a man reserves for officials. The bed remained made with its corners crisp. The full-length mirror leaned against the wall in a lazy pose, still wearing the brown paper edge from delivery. The portable scrim stood behind the curtain, its legs tucked like a folded insect. I began with my camera and a soft voice. People tell the truth when they are not asked to defend it. I photographed the mirror, the invoice tucked behind it, the number for El Nasser props and events stamped in a font that promised all manner of delights for all manner of fees. Kareem said the mirror was for his suit fittings. He traveled often. Hotel mirrors were treacherous. This one was supposed to be honest. I asked about the scrim. He shrugged without looking. A decorator had left it by mistake. The curtain motor was a standard feature, he said. He had not requested it. He had not noticed it. He knew the value of not noticing things that belonged to other people. The inspector asked him where he had been at 10:11. Kareem watched the inspector's face in the way a man watches the reflection in a window to gauge the street behind him. At 10:11, Kareem said he had been nowhere near a mirror. He had been in the hotel bar discussing a customs matter with a client. He offered to call the client. The inspector told him that would not be necessary and held up the receipt, which had the time of the tabs closing written in a familiar hand. The inspector asked about visitors. Kareem gave the room a little half-smile as if to apologize for how empty it was. No visitors. Not tonight. Not in any way that mattered. Dr. Khoury wandered toward the mirror with the brown paper edge and tilted her head. The corners of the paper were smoother than the middle, as if someone had worried them between a thumb and a finger while they thought. She turned to the invoice and scanned the handwritten note beside the printed items. A line read "Rush Hour +1." She tapped it. El Nasser used that phrase for last-minute theatrical deliveries that had to arrive just after peak traffic. It meant a prop meant to surprise someone. It meant an hour chosen the way a lock chooses a key. I asked to see the bellman log. Samir phoned the desk, and the desk sent up a slim young man with a tight tie and a memory arranged like a silverware drawer. He said a long mirror had come up mid-afternoon. It had been heavy enough to need two. The client had signed the delivery slip with the same rolling signature we had seen on the bar receipt. The slip also showed a contact number for El Nasser. The young man tried not to look at the inspector while he recited this. He looked at me. His eyes asked if he was in trouble. I shook my head and took the slip. On the lower edge of the scrim frame, near where hands pull without thinking, I saw a smear that had dried into a half circle. Stage blood leaves a tack that collects dust. Next to it, the dot was different. Smaller, browned at the edge where red surrenders to time. I photographed both and capped the lens with more care than necessary. The air carried again that thin iron scent that never belongs to a polite room. Kareem watched me notice. He shifted his weight and made his ring flash. He asked what we thought we were seeing. The inspector said we were seeing a room that had been asked to be two rooms at once. He asked why. Kareem lifted a shoulder. Traders sleep better when they control their light, he said. He said it without quite meaning to. Then he smiled in a way he had used to convince men who stamp papers to stamp them harder. We stepped into the corridor to confer, leaving the constable to lean against the wall with the ease the uniform allows. Dr. Khoury whispered what I had thought since I smelled myrrh in the cavity. Someone was building a theater, not for art, for leverage. A future made to order for those who pay and a future delivered to the police for those who do not. Show a death before it happens. Sell fear and sell the antidote. The apparatus in the walls was not a prophecy. It was a subscription service. We went back in and asked Kareem about changes to the hotel's infrastructure. He deflected without effort. He had many contacts. The hotel welcomed guests who contributed to its reputation. He had opinions about the conference floor and made them sound like gifts. He declared he did not know anyone at El Nasser personally, though the invoice suggested otherwise. The inspector let the contradiction rest where it would sting when the time came. I asked him to remove the ring. He smiled as if I had asked him to surrender a family member. He did not remove it. I photographed his hand with the ring anyway, the angle of the blue catching the lamp, the flecks of mica inside the stone throwing tiny refusals at the light. A lapis field has a way of making even a policeman feel like a tourist. The inspector asked him to remain available and to avoid the bar for the remainder of the night. Karim agreed as if granting a favor. He saw us out with the skill of a concierge. The door closed with a whisper the scrim could have envied. Out in the corridor, Samir exhaled the breath he had been counting. He did not like the idea of his hotel as a place where futures could be extorted like tips. He loved the building the way some men love a dog that has bitten everyone else. He asked what we would do next. The inspector said we would ask the building where the rest of the theater lived. I went back to the invoice and read the driver's initials. I called the number and let it ring until a woman's voice answered with the tone people use when they have a warehouse full of things they will not admit to owning. She confirmed the delivery. She confirmed the hour. She denied knowledge of any installation. She said they were a props company, not electricians. When I hung up, I saw that the swing arm lens in our cavity wore more of that pale polish from hands recently careful. The myrrh made a final appearance. A filament of air that bent toward the lobby, where the expensive incense burned for guests who asked for privacy first and apologies later. I followed it to the stairwell that doubled as the building's vein. The inspector followed behind, and we both heard the faint hum of equipment that prefers rooftops to basements. We were walking toward the power that teaches rooms to lie on cue. Along the way, I kept thinking of a mirror that had been delivered with the edges still dressed in paper. A prop that had not decided if it belonged to a wedding or a crime. The lapis ring flashed again in my memory, the little sky trapped on a knuckle, the way it had made the lens's flake of blue feel like more than dust. If someone had written a script, it was ready for rehearsal. And if a script exists, a stage manager exists, the one who calls the cues and counts down to the cut. Part 5, The Woman with Keys to Old Glass. We reached the lobby as the last of the late diners drifted out to smoke and argue about football. The high-fee incense drifted under the ceiling fans in thin ropes. Myrrh, frankincense, and something citrus that pretended to be housekeeping. The city pressed its reflection against the glass doors and let us borrow its noise. Inspector Farouk asked for a quiet room to talk. Samir chose an office behind the concierge desk, paneled in wood that had seen more apologies than sunlight. A low lamp shaped like a lotus gave the walls a kind color. We sat where guests usually sit when a bill requires more words than money. Dr. Layla Khoury stood near the window with her gloves in one hand and her notebook in the other. The inspector began with the simple lines a puzzle cannot slip past. Your grant, your donor, your interest in this mirror before tonight. He spoke as if he were reading out a grocery list, and that was his way of letting the food confess its own salt. Khoury did not fidget. She listened the way a conservator listens to a cracked glaze. She said her current study concerned pre-modern mirror silvering, tin and mercury laid on glass that was blown rather than cast. The hotel had acquired a large mirror with an irregular backplate and a history it liked to bring up when important guests asked for a story to go with the room rate. She had asked permission to examine it, to document the backing and the wood frame, and to look for the marks old restorers leave behind when they think no one will ever care. The inspector asked who paid for her field work. She said the university covered travel and modest per diem, and a private donor supplemented equipment costs. She named the donor. The name carried a soft echo in the room, the way a coin announces itself when it drops on marble. The donor held shares in a shipping company that did business with Karim Haddad. She did not deny the connection. She said she had never met Karim outside the hotel corridors. She said the donor had a public list of interests and loved to see their name floating near culture. I asked if the private contribution required deliverables beyond footnotes. Sometimes money asks for a favor in a separate envelope. She looked at me with a quick rueful smile and said money always asks for a story later. She said no one had asked her to build anything in the wall of room 402. I asked for her notes. She handed me the notebook without a theatrical pause. The first pages were exactly what I expected. Measurements of the frame, estimates of the plate thickness at the corner, a sketch of the beveled edge where a 19th century cut had tried to be modern and polite at the same time. Then the diagrams changed their speed. She had drawn the cavity, the swing arm, the half-silvered pane, and a relay path to a second panel across a shaft. She had not guessed the numbers, but she had drawn the route with the confidence of someone who knew light will always choose the shortest argument. The inspector looked up from the sketch. When did you draw this? Corey said she drew the first outline yesterday afternoon, after a maintenance man mentioned a draft behind the mirror, and she felt the spring in the frame. She said she confirmed the arm and pain tonight after we opened the cavity. She had been curious. She had not broken anything. Her gloves were clean. I looked at the gloves on the desk. They were clean at first glance. At the cuffs, a thin gray smear caught the light. Mercury leaves a whisper on cotton that looks like pencil before it darkens into confession. I asked to see her hands. She showed me palms and fingers, the nail beds square and tidy, the skin of a person who handles glass with the respect reserved for blades and saints. I held the gloves up to the low lamp. The smear had the dull gravitas of amalgam. She saw my face before I told her what I saw. She said she had handled the back of the hotel mirror during inspection. She had breathed on it, lifted a corner of the backing with the edge of a plastic spatula, and taken a microsample. The smear, she said, would be from that. She had not touched the lens collar. She had not turned the buffer dial. She said this with the tired patience of a teacher explaining to a parent that a child had indeed written on the wall, but only the part that belonged to the lesson. I asked her to return to the first vision at 10:11. Tell me exactly what your eyes gave you that your notes did not. She closed her own eyes just long enough for the room to become a stage with no scenery. The curtains in the reflection were not our curtains, she said. Not only because they were half open when ours were shut. They were a different cloth when the light lifted through them. A Venetian blind effect, as if thin slats were present for a breath and then gone. Our curtains are single fabric without lining. There was a texture in the reflection that did not belong to either room. The line spacing was too even, too perfect for cloth. It looked like slatted light on a stage flat. It looked like an insert where someone forgot the seam. She opened her eyes and let the office come back. I asked if she had written that down. She nodded to the page. I had missed the annotation in the corner because she had written it lightly. A habit scholars develop when they want to remember without shouting at their own memory. The words were small. Venetian slat flare in glass. Does not match 402 or 404 fabric. The inspector drew a very straight line across his notepad and spoke without looking up. If the base of the illusion comes from 404 and the texture does not belong to 402 or 404, then a third source provides inserts. We will find where in the building one can pump a little extra picture into the half-silvered pane. Samir rubbed his forehead as if searching for a secret pocket in the skull. He remembered the festival. Years ago, a film festival had rented the hotel and brought more cables than anyone had believed possible. The contractors had left a redundant audio-visual trunk in the walls because removing it would have cost more than the hotel had been willing to spend on the memory of a week. One branch of that trunk, Samir now recalled, had gone up to the roof. The satellite dishes had long since changed owners, but a spur remained that pointed toward the older wing across the narrow alley. The hotel had a little sky road still open to anyone who knew the old map. We climbed. The roof kept the heat of the day and let it go slowly into the night. The satellite array looked like a quiet flock waiting for a signal that had not been invented yet. Samir guided us to a box the color of excuses. Inside it sat a delay buffer, a squat rectangle with a dial. The dial wore a piece of tape at the 13-minute mark, the way a musician marks the sweet spot on a fader. Next to the dial, someone had left a sticker with a company name rubbed to initials by weather and finger. And a Shelek. The dash was a scraped scar. The name might have been Noura Elibieri, if you believed in the coincidences that follow jobs paid in cash. Events technicians make friends in hotels. Hotels make enemies by accident. We traced the spur. It did not look up to the sky. It pointed across the alley to a bank of windows that belonged to a different set of floors. Room numbers began with 6. The angle matched a line that would land on 612 if you drew it as a child draws sunbeams. We went back through the service stair where the wall paint remembers every bag that brushed it. On the landing between 5 and 6, a faint tick came through the plaster. It was not mechanical stress. It was a servo skate against a rod. A small motor taking a curtain exactly where a cue sheet had asked it to go. The inspector did not smile. He does not enjoy being right. He enjoys being done. The corridor outside 612 had the expensive hush guests by when they think quiet is dignity. The door register said the room belonged to a woman who had checked in for a single night and paid in advance with a company card in the events trade. The name was Noura Elibieri. The desk had taken a phone number with that name and had sent up a small crate at dusk marked for fragile electronics. The bellman had received a tip in coins that smelled of new metal and soap. We did not knock. The inspector showed Samir the signed authorization, and Samir opened the door with a key that keeps the building in one piece. Inside, the air smelled of coffee that had been poured and then forgotten. On the table sat a compact switcher, no larger than a pair of hardback books. Cables braided out to a small monitor, a router, and what looked like a driver for a curtain motor. A storyboard lay beside the switcher, schedules written in a hand that enjoyed tidy violence. 11:11, curtains. 11:12, cut. 11:13, fade. A photograph was pinned to the corner of the page. Inspector Farouk at a prior seizure, standing beside a pallet of seized antiquities. The photograph had been clipped from a news site and loved with scissors. On a chair leaned a folding knife, the same profile we had watched arrive in the glass. On the floor sat a small blood pump used in practical effects, the kind that sprays a neat arc when pressed from a safe height. I took in the room the way a stage manager takes in a set half an hour before curtain. Everything had a place and a purpose. Everything waited for a cue. Curry stood very still and looked at the boards that gave order to someone else's idea of fate. She touched her gloves again as if they were a passport. She said quietly, perhaps to herself, that old glass remembers, but it rarely invents. People teach it what to keep. We could have arrested on that tableau alone, but the inspector prefers chains that hold in court. He asked Samir to pull the guest file for Noura, all of it, and to mark the room for no service. He asked me to keep my camera moving. He asked Curry what she saw in the switcher patch list that I did not. She bent and traced a cable with her finger. The labels were neat. One feed from the hotel distribution, one feed from the buffer box, one feed from a local camera that could put its picture directly into the pane if you only pushed the slider far enough. The slider had a nick at a position that would make a slatted texture overlay just bright enough to read as a blind lifted over a window. Base from 404. Insert from 612. Display in 402. A triangle like a trap. The inspector straightened and looked at the ceiling as if the building itself were a witness that needed coaxing. We had the stage. We had the switchboard. We had the curtain line. We did not yet have the person whose hands put them all to work or the reason they chose tonight to make the mirror run a murder that might be rehearsal or might be debut. The city breathed against the windows. Somewhere below us a muezzin began the call, low and steady, a line drawn through the night. In the room, the storyboard kept its little times. 11:11, 11:12, 11:13. The numbers had the gravity of a sentence. We would meet the operator soon. Whether she meant to threaten or to cut, the apparatus was ready to serve either script. Part 6, the hotel's unlisted power. Hotels tell their truest stories in the rooms no guest is meant to see. Between the polished corridors and the bright lobby, there is another city made of racks and trunks and stair-stepped cable trays. If you want to know how a lie learns to speak, you follow the wire to its first mistake. We left room 612 sealed and quiet. A do not disturb card in the inspector's handwriting tucked at the edge of the latch where only a certain kind of eye would notice. The constable posted halfway down the hall looked like an umbrella stand and the kind of boredom that wins prizes. We descended into the building's spine. Samir walked ahead with the confidence of a man who had once slept on a coil of cable to make sure it did not vanish before the morning show. He took us through a door labeled Housekeeping Overflow and into a narrow corridor where the carpet died and the concrete began. The air changed from perfume to metal. The walls wore the scuffs of laundry carts and the signatures of forgotten contractors, pencil arcs and dates for jobs no one would pay to do twice. This is where the festival lived, Samir said. He meant the year when a film delegation had turned the hotel into a hive and left gifts the way bees leave comb. He stopped at a locked cabinet the color of an apology and opened it. Inside, a redundant audio-visual trunk waited like a sleeping animal. The trunk split 3 ways. One route fed the conference floor where microphones learn to pretend they are not listening. One ran down toward a basement room full of amplifiers that still dreamed of music. The last ran up toward the roof in a slow braid, the way a story climbs when it knows it will have an audience. We traced the upward path. Junction boxes appeared at intervals like commas in a sentence written by a bureaucrat. At each, a piece of tape labeled with tidy script and a phone number now out of service. The neatness made me think of a person who had learned to be precise because imprecision gets you fired when shows go live. Near an elbow bend, someone had affixed a small sticker half scraped away by a fingernail. And a shellac. The dash had been a hyphen before it became a scar. The adhesive still carried a peppery resin scent that did not belong to the hotel. Samir unlocked the roof hatch and held it while we stepped into Cairo's breath. Metal cooled the hands and then gave them back their warmth. The satellite array sat like an arrangement of patient white petals. It should have been a fossil. Instead, it felt like a garden that had been watered at dusk. In a gray utility box under windscored plexiglass, a delay buffer squatted with the assurance of a brick. The dial on its face wore a thin strip of cloth tape. On the tape, a felt tip line at 12:59, and beside it a second mark sketched in later at 13:00. Someone had tuned superstition to a rounder number after the device had been in service long enough to begin believing in itself. The inspector took out his phone, photographed the dial, photographed my camera photographing the dial, and then wrote down the tape's texture and the position of the nick in the knurled edge. In court, texture and nick sometimes testify better than people. The spur that should have looked toward a satellite did not look at the sky at all. It looked like a man refusing to meet your eyes. The dish was aimed across the alley to a rectangular pane 3 floors below us and 1 wing over. The pane belonged, by Samir's map and the logic of hotel numeration, to room 612. We ran a simple triangulation with what we had. The inspector stood at the dish with a flashlight. Samir and I went back to the 6th floor corridor. At 612, I pressed my ear to the door. The room stayed asleep. From the window of the service landing 2 doors down, I gave a thumbs up to the roof. The inspector clicked the flashlight in a count we had agreed on. The beam laced the dust in the air like a fishing line and landed against the curtain in a soft square. The path was clean. The building had been taught to pass an image along this line, patient as a mule, faithful as a night watchman. Back downstairs, Samir produced invoices. He did it with the muttered gloom of a man confessing to a priest he did not choose. Weeks ago, an events contractor had billed the hotel for remedial work on the conference floor distribution. The company name on the bill was an alias so thin I could have blown through it. New Ilix for events. The address was a co-working space. The signature at the bottom was a loop that remembered writing Neura once. The hotel had paid cash through a third party because the last time the accounting system was used for an independent contractor, it had triggered a tax audit no one wanted to remember. Samir, I said, how did you not smell this when it began? He looked at me with the weary love of a man for a building that makes him lie for it. We are an old house, he said. Old houses do not catch every draft. People in my position learn to be grateful when things work. Gratitude is a blindfold you tie yourself. We traced the other branch of the trunk down to a server closet on the conference floor. The closet was lit by a single strip that made the dust look like a decision. Racks waited with green eyes. A small router sat on a shelf that had not been designed for it. Its power light winked on a heartbeat that did not match the hotel's network cadence. Inspector Farouk is not an engineer, but he knows the look of an unlogged device in a building that loves logs. He photographed the MAC address sticker and the scribble beside it that tried to be a serial number and failed at the last digit. A ledger book lay on a stool. Yes, a book in an age of spreadsheets. The maintenance chief kept a handwritten supplement because electricity goes out when stories get interesting. The pages for the last week showed notes in a careful square hand. Replace splitter on ballroom B. Tested feed to roof buffer. Adjusted delay to 12:59 per events. The per events note carried a phone number that matched the one on the scraped sticker. The next line had been scratched out so hard the page had torn. Underneath, if you held it to the light, you could make out the words test curtain motor pulse. We called the maintenance chief from his bed and brought him in under the fiction of a burst pipe. He arrived with sleep on his face and a hard hat in his hand because some men cannot walk without their tools. He looked at the book and tried to scowl the page back into innocence. He admitted what the notes already said. An outside contractor had asked for test access to the feed chain. They had spoken knowledgeably, paid for refreshments, brought their own patch cables, and left 2 new units as a gift. One was the small router we had photographed. The other was a signal conditioner that no one had asked for and no one had the courage to remove because it was making the conferences sound lovely. Names, the inspector said. The chief shrugged a narrow shrug. He knew only first names and the way people wore their lanyards. One was called Noura. One was called Sam or Sammy. They had seemed like a couple who had stopped being a couple but still shared a calendar. We found a second sticker, still whole, on the inside of the trunk lid. Noura Elek, events and lighting. A phone number. A web address that led nowhere last month and resolved to a portfolio today. The portfolio boasted a set of rooms washed in tasteful color, a government gala with discreet uplights, and a corporate launch where the brand mark had been projected on a wall in a way that looked like a blessing and felt like a threat. In one photo, behind a smiling minister, Karim stood at the edge of the frame, wearing the lapis ring and talking to a man whose tie kept trying to crawl away. We did not need a private investigator to draw a dotted line. Noura had once worked launches that Karim greased. Karim had introduced her to managers who kept keys and budgets. Then something had soured. The sticker on the buffer dial told one story. The neat nick in the knurl told another. The ledger's torn line tried to keep its secret and failed. Back on the roof, the wind had risen. The dish to 612 hummed softly, a noise like a moth against a lampshade. I looked over the alley and imagined a picture walking down the cable, obedient as a hired witness. In room 402, the half-silvered pane would lean in to listen. In room 404, the television would run ahead by the minute granted by its buffer. The relay would add the rest. The mirror would become a screen. If someone wanted to lay an extra skin of picture over the whole, they could push it from 612 with a fingertip and a storyboard that read curtains, cut, fade. We tested the chain in daylight fashion. Samir radioed the constable outside 404 and asked him to pull the television from the wall mount far enough to see the receiver model. He read the model number. I checked it against the catalog on my phone. It was the version that offered a user buffer deep enough to smooth bad conference internet into apparent grace. 13 minutes was a comedy for a hospitality brochure, but a sacrament for a blackmail stage. The inspector leaned over the roof rail and watched the city's neon write its old arguments on the air. He said the thing he says when the puzzle begins to march. We can prove function. Now we find intent. He meant motive, of course, but he is a man who prefers what a device does to what a person wants. Devices keep appointments. People invent alibis. We returned to the service corridor where the sound of the elevator machinery carried like a metronome. On the way, Samir stopped at a bulletin board where laminated notices tried to outlive time. He pulled down a curling sheet that announced a discount for preferred vendors. Events, lighting, staging. The list was short. At the bottom, a note in pencil said special rates for friends of Karim. The pencil had been erased and then rewritten. It is difficult to erase a favor. At the office, the inspector asked for the personnel file on contractors with master access. Noura's name was not there. The chief had added it in pencil on a copy and kept it pinned under the original. He did not think it would matter if a friend of a friend came by to make a hotel look good for a night or two. Friends of friends make cities move. They also make mirrors lie. By the time we finished a lap of the building's unlisted power, midnight had seeped into the edges of the carpet at the lobby like a tide. I could feel the case tightening the way a belt tightens when you stand. The triangle was clear enough to draw in the air with a finger. 404 for the stage, 612 for the overlay, 402 for the show, the roof for the buffered heartbeat, the conference closet for the hush between them. We had a map. We had the stickers and the invoices and a ledger that could be read by a court if a judge still believed in handwriting. We had a dish pointing into a window and a buffer set to 13 minutes like a superstition carved into a dial. We had a name that once shared a business with Karim and now rented a room with a switcher and a storyboard that treated minutes like commandments. put eyes on 612, the inspector said at last. Keep the corridor clean. No one in or out without a camera counting. If the operator is there, we make the stage go live on our time, not on hers. The constable touched his radio and gave that brave, foolish sound police make when they answer yes to a plan that could go wrong in only one way. I checked my batteries and thought about glass, about how it forgets its shape when it is heated, about how it learns to hold a curve again when it cools. The hotel had been heated by other people's plans. We were going to cool it back to the truth if we could, and we were going to do it before the mirror borrowed another minute from life. Part 7, The Overlay Room. We returned to room 612 with the kind of silence a stage crew keeps before the curtain. The constable at the end of the hall watched the elevator blink its numbers like a patient animal. Inside 612, the switcher still sat on the table, its sliders in careful positions, its power light a small green eye. The storyboard lay open to a page with a neat ladder of times and verbs. Curtains. Cut. Fade. The folding knife kept its angle on the chair as if listening for its cue. The door clicked behind us. A key slid home from the outside. The handle turned halfway and stopped with the sound of someone deciding between leaving a place alone and owning it. The door opened. A woman entered with a coiled cable over one shoulder. She had the calm of a technician who has spent years being invisible in rooms where the important people stand under lights. She put the cable on the bed, reached for the switcher with a comfortable hand, and then saw us. Her eyes measured the room without moving. They took in Samir, whose expression said property more than law. They took in Dr. Khoury, whose posture belonged in museums. They took in me and my camera. They landed on Inspector Farouk and recognized a kind of gravity. She looked at the storyboard and asked, in a voice that had smoked late and laughed early, if we planned to attend the show. The inspector answered her with her name. He said it the way he says words he has already written into the file. Noura Elibieri. She did not pretend otherwise. She rested one hip against the table and looked at the switcher with the affection that electricians keep for machines that do what they are told. She said we could call the room a rehearsal space. She said no one had been hurt. She said the hotel had rented her a room and her company had provided a service. Lighting, atmosphere, technical advice. The oldest lies know how to dress as ordinary work. The inspector asked what service exactly. She tapped the storyboard with a nail that had been chewed and painted over. We stage possibilities, she said. A future. A warning. Some clients take the hint and pay what they owe before they see their names in a report. Some adjust their behavior if you prefer a kinder verb. We do not make people bleed. We show them what neglect looks like when it keeps time. I let the camera record the room breathing. The blood pump sat on the floor like a toy the wrong child would pick up. The knife on the chair sat quietly. The notes on the board kept their little sermon. 11:11. Curtains. 11:12. Cut. The inspector remained steady. He asked who tonight's target was. Noura shifted her weight and looked at the ceiling as if the answer might be carved there in soft gypsum. She said the name we were already holding. Kareem. He had held back money from a joint job and he had laughed when asked to make it right. She had a client who wanted him brought to a decision without paperwork. Sometimes a person needs to be shown their future to remember their debts. She said it like a teacher giving the moral of a fable. Samir made a low sound that hotels make when something touches the place where pride lives. He asked if she had installed the buffer on the roof, if she had paid off maintenance, if she had drilled holes through his building and called it atmosphere. She did not bother to deny it. She said the infrastructure had been waiting to be useful. She said the festival had left the trunk. She had given it purpose. It had been an elegant rig, she said, and there was nothing illegal about elegance. The inspector turned the switcher toward her and tapped the labels. Base feed, buffer feed, local camera. He asked about the fourth label, the one written in pencil and then rubbed with a finger until it wore the fuzz of guilt. She shrugged. An overlay pattern. Venetian slats. A texture to make the curtains look like a different world for a second. It had tested well on the glass. It made the eye believe. He asked about the knife. She smiled without joy. She said practical effects require props. She held the knife in 2 fingers as if it were nothing more than a line on a diagram. It opened with a soft click. The blade was narrow, clean, bored with all this. She closed it again and set it down gently. She said the blood pump had been used on set jobs for years and never hurt anyone who was not already being paid to pretend. I asked who paid her tonight. She let the name sit in the air without landing. She said a client with interests in cargo. She said the better question was who had the most to gain if the video of Karim dying hit the police at precisely 11:12. That would not be her. That would be someone who wanted the cargo question to stop moving. She had intended panic and a wire transfer, not a body. She said it plain, and my camera liked her for it. The inspector asked where she had been at 10:11. She said she had been in this room, testing the patch, pushing the slider, watching the pane across the shaft glow with the right level. She had not sent the phone call to 402 at 11:09. She had not tripped the dedicated breaker for the television in 402. She had that look technicians get when they are offended by bad work. Her cues were cleaner than what had happened. Some other hand had reached in and added its own notes to the score. She crossed to the window and pulled the curtain aside to look down the narrow alley to the wing where 402 and 404 faced the night. She pointed to the roof line. The dish is aimed properly. The buffer dial is set where we left it. She turned back to the switcher, but the remote access log on this unit shows an intrusion at 2254 from a network inside the hotel that is not this room. We saw the address, a line of numbers as impersonal as an invoice. Someone from the conference floor had tried the sliders and enjoyed the feeling. Dr. Curry stepped closer to the switcher and read the log as if it were a marginal note in a medieval book. She traced the timestamps. At 10:58, a line marked rehearsal end. At 22:59, a line marked external handshaking. At 23:11, a line simply marked standby override. The writing on the storyboard did not change, but the room felt different now, as if the script had been stolen and performed elsewhere. The inspector asked her about Karim beyond the invoice. Noura eased herself onto the chair with the knife and did not touch it this time. She said she had started in events as a lighting assistant, then graduated to lead. She had run cables for Karim's shipping firm when they sponsored galas. He had been useful. Then he had been greedy. He had inserted himself as a fixer for technical staff to get better rates, then skimmed the difference. When she found out, she cut him out. She had a partner then, a man who preferred to be paid in cash and who could adjust a buffet line so the minister would meet the right camera at the right time. The partner had left. She had remaining debts and a new sense of humor about justice. The mirror trick was profitable because fear pays faster than gratitude. The inspector asked why the storyboard had a photograph of him pinned to the corner. She met his eye. Because the only thing officials hate more than a liar is being shown a theater they did not buy a ticket for. She had thought of sending the video to his desk to speed things along with her client. She said it as if she were saying something ordinary like the weather will be warm tomorrow. We took her phone. She did not argue. On it we found drafts of messages to Karim that had never been sent. Be at your room at 11. Watch the mirror. The money moves and the future changes. We found a payment schedule in a simple spreadsheet that would have made any auditor smile. We found nothing about a real cut at 11:12. Her pride was in convincing others to run to the bank. She had no appetite for a courtroom where blood is not theatrical. The phone on the table in 612 pinged with a gentle sound. A message arrived. It was not to Noura. It was to the switcher itself, a status check from the same conference floor network. The inspector looked at the green light. It pulsed once as the unit accepted the ping, the way a sleeper shifts when a door opens in a dream. He turned it off at the mains. We took Noura with us to the office behind the concierge desk. She walked easily, as if she expected to return to the room before the night was over. In the office, she refused a chair, leaned against the file cabinet, and watched the hotel breathe through the window glass. I looked at my watch. The minutes near 11 had the feel of a cliff. The mirror at 10:58 had given us a forecast. Karim face down at 11:11. In 404 he had been brisk and oily. He had closed his bill at 22:58 and walked out without a stumble. Now he was quiet. Too quiet. The corridor constable did not report movement. The latch tape on 402 had not broken. Our triangle of rooms held their positions like chess pieces between turns. We had the operator for the overlays and the stage. We had her confession to the theater. We did not have anyone admitting the will to make the cut real. Noura said again that she did not intend a real death. She said the knife in 612 was dull. She said the blood pump was charged only for a rehearsal. She said someone else had their hand in the machine. The inspector called for another constable to take her statement and to keep her in sight. He told Samir to prepare a master power plan for the floors in question and to make a list of breakers by room. He told me to return to 402 with my camera and to keep the glass in frame and myself out of it. He said it the way a person says hold this door open. He meant hold it against what wants to come through. We moved at once. The corridor seemed to lengthen with every step. I have felt that in churches and in hospitals when the night decides to stretch. The elevator blinked its numbers up. Somewhere below, a door closed softly, too soft to be honest. We split on the landing. The inspector to 404. Me to 402. Noura toward the office under escort. The hotel, which had been an instrument tuned to a superstition, now felt like a clock someone had wound too hard. The mirror would either show a man dying because a storyboard demanded it, or it would learn to tell the truth at last. Either way, the minute approached with its shoulders set. Kareem had been quiet too long. Part 8, the room goes live. I reached 402 2 minutes before the hour with my camera humming and my breath counting down in quiet fours. The constable at the door peeled back the tape, let me in, and resealed it with the small ritual of a man who understands what a line means. The room had learned to behave like a chapel. The carpet waited. The glass held its face with that unhelpful honesty mirrors practice when they know something and will not say. Across the shaft, Inspector Farouk keyed into 404. I heard his footfall through the cavity like a pulse in a wall. He said my name once, low, and I said I was in position. Samir stood behind me with a list of breakers. Everyone circled in pencil. The hotel's breath ran in the vents. It felt like listening to a patient whose heart has its own opinion. At 10:58 by my camera, the mirror changed. It did not warm up. It did not flare. It settled into its 13-minute vow. In the glass, 404 showed itself ahead of us by a clean and practiced interval. The curtains there were half drawn. The television there was dark. On the carpet there, Kareem lay face down with one arm crooked under him and the other struggling to decide whether it was reaching or surrendering. The line at his throat was a clean subtraction, not a mess. The arc to his right was tidy, the mark of a hand that believes angles absolve. In our room, the air was uncut. Samir whispered the kind of prayer that sounds suspiciously like math. I set the interval timer and then let the video run continuous. I said aloud what the glass insisted on showing so that later, when memory argued, we would have the grammar of this moment on record. Across the shaft, the inspector's voice arrived like a radio under a blanket. He announced himself into 404, then stopped speaking. When he came back, his words were clipped. Mina, he said. He is here. He is alive. Drugged. He used the word precisely, not dramatically. The constable with him named a pulse and a shallow breath. The first aid kit in 404 did not bother to pretend it contained antidotes for the life men choose. The inspector found an ampoule with a faded label and put it aside. He did not play blind chemist. He called down the corridor for a medic anyway. He crouched at Kareem's shoulder and spoke the man's name. Kareem did not answer, but his fingers tried once to close on air. I kept my lens on the mirror. In the glass, the hand arrived, the neat glove entering frame at 11:12 in its world with the same grace I had hated earlier. It carried the folding knife like a word spoken too many times. The reflection had no sound, but my body supplied one. A soft click, the blade opening, the cut laid down as if drawn with a ruler. A second arc completing a teacher's curvature. My stomach learned then how much a person can despise neatness. The house telephone rang at 11:09. In my room it sounded small, like a memory of a bell rather than the thing itself. The display did not show an extension. Samir had his hand on the receiver and looked to me. I nodded. He lifted it. There was breathing. There was the crude murmur of a television elsewhere and the high whine of a cheap laptop fan. A man's voice came that could have been anyone's if everyone were tired and righteous. He said 3 words, "Let the hour." Then he hung up. The desk had seen no call. The internal log would show nothing. The hotel is good at courtesy. It learns evasion only when forced. The inspector spoke again, lower than before. He named a small puncture near Karim's elbow. "Ketamine," he said after a breath, neither surprised nor happy. He had seen it before, in clubs and on floors where control had been mistaken for mercy. The vial in the wastebasket said veterinary on the label in fine letters for no one to read at a party. He told me he was cutting zip ties from Karim's wrists and ankles. The mirror showed none of that. It kept the future it had been paid to keep. I moved to the cavity. The swing arm lens wore fingerprints that had learned their lesson. I wiped a circle with a glove and leaned in to see if the half-silvered pane carried any extra picture now. It did not. The overlay did not originate here. The little triangles of the lattice across the shaft winked back a pattern I knew too well. It was simply the machine doing what it had been told. In 612, the switcher would be waiting. Noura had been marched to the office with a constable and a notebook, but her room still held the small green eyes of the unit. I asked Samir for the corridor key and stepped into the service shaft. He protested once and then handed it over. The inspector's voice reached me again through the wall. He said to keep my radio open and my promises small. I moved along the maintenance corridor, past the dull harmonics of plumbing and the secret conversations of old timber. At 612, I let myself in. The light bled from the street through the curtains. The switcher's log screen sat up like a patient who had been pretending to sleep. Remote control activate red. It named an address from inside the hotel, the conference floor segment we had photographed. The slider positions were locked to a little automation script. At 11:11, fade curtain. At 11:12, push local insert. At 11:13, normalize. The entries glowed calm as saints. I killed the unit at the back. It hummed into quiet. A second later, the screen flickered back, drawn to life by a power source I had not accounted for. Under the table, a small, uninterruptible battery pack blinked its own green. I pulled its plug. It grinned and stayed alive. Battery, after all, does not honor plugs. "Inspector," I said, "I am in 612. Remote control is live from the conference floor. There is a battery under the switcher." He said to yank it. I did. The unit died with the small bad temper of a turtle put down away from its pond. 11:11 rolled over me like a car that did not slow. In my room, the mirror had already given us the corpse. In 404, the inspector, with gloved hands and quiet wrists, turned Karim onto his side to keep his airway honest. He talked the way men talk to a sleeping dog. "Stay," he said. "Stay." The phone on the switcher table stuttered a notification. A message from an address that belonged to the conference router, a status check. When the unit did not answer, another message followed, shorter, angrier. The slider positions in the dead screen did not move, but somewhere between the building's bones, a command passed like a thought. In 402, with me absent from the frame, the curtains shifted in the mirror. In the actual room, according to Samir's whispered disgust, the curtains obeyed a motor I had not found and began to close themselves with a neat insistence. He jerked them back. The machine waited 3 beats and pulled the fabric again. Politeness, I have learned, is a weapon when it is automatic. At 11:12, the mirror laid down its neat violence. The gloved hand completed the cut that Karim was not receiving in the real room. I found myself speaking to the air. Not tonight. Not here. The air did not answer. Samir, on the radio, let out a sound he had not planned to make. The carpet in 402 stayed clean. The reflection kept its lesson. I looked at the switcher's network page. The intrusion came from a room on the conference level labeled C in the extension map. C for Conference C, a space where auditors drink water and rehearse saying no. The device name offered a joke to anyone who could read hex codes and boredom at the same time. Mahfouz. The name meant nothing to me yet, but its confidence did. Whoever sat in that room believed in numbers more than in blood. I scooped the switcher and the battery into a bag. I took the knife on the chair and the blood pump on the floor. I photographed the empty spaces they left like proof of a magician's act in reverse. Then I ran. The corridor stretched again. The elevator had chosen another life. I took the stairs. On the landing, a room service tray sat abandoned. 2 plates with the lamb reduced to memory and a slice of cake tilted toward an opinion. I smelled coffee cooling, and beneath it, the calmer smell of adhesive burning a little under load. The building had been asked to do too much. In 404, the inspector's voice changed from report to command. He needed a medic now. Kareem's pulse had found an edge. Another constable answered that he was on the floor with the kit and a pair of hands capable of learning. In 402, Samir breathed into the radio and told me the breaker for the television had tripped again at 11:11 exactly, and the house phone had rung a second time at 11:12 and showed nothing, as if the system believed privacy were a virtue at murder. I reached the conference level breathing hard and set the bag down beside a door labeled C in a font that wanted to be helpful. Inside, typing happened like rain. The smell of mercury brushed my throat, not from the mirror but from the faint dust of the cavity on someone's cuff. The chair legs made the small sound chairs make when a patient man shifts. I checked my time. 11:13 caught up to us and decided to live here. Behind me, in the rooms we had turned into a diagram, the mirror at last relaxed into the same present we occupied. The curtains in the glass matched the curtains in 402. The television woke from its staged blackout and trudged back to the news. The arc on the reflected carpet faded to a shadow no one would photograph. In 404, the inspector had Kareem propped and breathing as if life were a task you could coach someone through. In 612, the switcher lay in my bag, sulking without power. The hour had been allowed, but not the death, which meant someone in room C had just lost a piece of fortune he had been certain belonged to him. When men lose certain fortune, they improvise. Improvisation leaves fingerprints even on ideas. I lifted my hand to knock, then let it fall. I opened the door with the same care I use for shutters. The room had a laptop open to a cross of video windows, a man in a gray shirt whose cuffs were speckled with something that glinted like a lie under a cheap light, and a ledger beside him filled with the neat columns people write when they wish to be forgiven by arithmetic. He turned at the sound of the hinge. His face had the modest features of those who carry quiet anger successfully. He did not reach for the laptop. He reached for the power strip on the floor. I stepped forward and put my foot on it. I said my name the way I say it to brides when the veil catches. He looked at me and tried to make his mouth learn admiration or fear. It learned neither. He said a single sentence in a steady voice that knew about sums and schedules. "You are late by 13 minutes. Part 9, the conference floor and the accountant." His badge on the lanyard said Mahfouz Accounting, a company that rents quiet men by the hour and sells serenity to people who fear receipts. The laptop on the table showed 2 windows side by side. On the left, for 104 as my lens had just seen it, the inspector kneeling beside Kareem, the pale slack of a man dragged back from a manageable edge. On the right, for 102 through the half-silvered pane, delayed into the story the switcher had been told to love. The overlays had frozen when I killed the power in 612. The show was over. The archive, however, was very much alive. He did not close the laptop because closing a thing is an admission. He watched my shoe on the power strip as if he were judging a balance sheet. His voice belonged to a man who has practiced telling clients their invention does not equal income. "You are late by 13 minutes, he said. I said the mirror had learned that habit from him. I said his name in the formal way that makes a room square up. Rami Mahfouz. He gave me the nod clerks give when you have spelled a surname correctly over the phone. On his desk lay a folding razor with a steel tang and a blade slim as a grudge. Next to it, a stack of custom slips, each stamped and initialed, the columns reconciled in a square hand that would have made a monk proud. A paperback ledger sat open to a page where numbers marched themselves into truth. In the upper corner, where men doodle when the math behaves, a small diagram showed a rectangle labeled 402, an arrow to a circle labeled buffer, then another rectangle labeled 404, then a triangle labeled 612. He had drawn our theater and filed it inside his head as a solvency problem. Inspector Farouk arrived in the doorway without drama, a shape that rooms learn to accept as proof they can no longer lie. He took in the desk in a single sweep, then let his gaze return to the razor. Rami followed it and smiled with the patience of a person who believes in exculpatory detail. "I shave with it," he said. "My father taught me." The blade was clean, to be fair. The handle wore no blood, theatrical or otherwise. The guilt, when it came, would not come from the knife. The inspector introduced himself and asked for identification. Rami produced an ID card and handed it over with the tidy pride of a man whose name survives audits. He said he had been hired to reconcile customs slips for a shipping firm with a stubborn cash leak. He did not say Kareem. The paperwork on the table said it for him with the persistence of letterhead. I stepped closer. The cuffs of Rami's gray shirt carried a dust that had the dead shine of coins. I touched the edge of my glove to one speck and raised it into the light. It grained like pencil, then darkened slowly into that sullen tone mercury keeps when it has been worked and then left to cool. I looked at his hands. A fine film sat at the base of one thumbnail, a line that would have been invisible in any other room. In ours, it declared a pilgrimage. The cavity behind the mirror of 402 wears its amalgam like a history lesson. Anyone who had put their fingers on the half-silvered pane's housing would come away with exactly that ash. The inspector noted the stain, photographed it against a ruler and a clock, then returned to the laptop. He did not touch the keys. He asked Rami to explain the script that had tripped the television breaker in 402 at 11:11 and the curtain motor pulse that had disobeyed 2 human hands. Rami did not pretend to be ignorant. He said the hotel network is the kind children draw when they draw a spider. Many legs, all competent, no head. He had found a forgotten node in the conference closet and taught it to speak to the switcher. He had enjoyed, his tone admitted, the sensation of moving curtains with a line of code and making a television black out as if it had remembered a sin. "Why," the inspector said, without temperature. Rami gestured at the ledger. The shipping firm bled from 2 places. Kareem skimmed from the top with the appetite of a man who thinks himself invulnerable. Someone else skimmed from the bottom with the patience of a spider. Numbers drew the mouth of the bottom thief more precisely than any witness could. Rami had traced both leaks and asked the firm's owner if he wished the bleeding to be treated as an accounting issue or an operational crisis. The owner had asked for a solution that would not involve law, because law brings paperwork, and paperwork attracts attention. "You found Noura," I said. "You rented her theater and decided the show should have a closing night." He shook his head once. "Noura's idea of vengeance is too performative for someone who worships columns. She wanted a wire transfer and a rush of fear. I wanted a ledger that balanced and an absence where the leak stood. The mirror offered a way to take a man off the board inside a story that made sense to police. A pre-visualized murder in which the victim later appeared face down at the right minute would look like fate meeting evidence. No one would ask whose hand wrote the cue. The building had been tuned to cooperate. I provided the push. "You meant to let Noura's cut become real," the inspector said. Rami did not argue. He disliked the word meant. He preferred intended. He preferred phrases like was prepared for. He said Kareem had moved money that did not belong to him and held documents that could put decent men in prison because even decent men hire fixers. He said decent men prefer not to meet court clerks. He said the world benefits when an error erases itself. He had the unlovely confidence of someone who believes morality is arithmetic you refuse to round. The inspector asked about the call to 402 at 11:09. Rami did not blink. He said a soft human voice makes machines more persuasive. He had rung the house phone from a soft phone on his laptop with a hidden caller identification. He had said let the hour into the receiver because ritual matters when you want people to surrender agency to clocks. He turned the laptop toward us now as if offering dessert. The screen showed a control panel with sliders, checkboxes, and 3 little scripts whose names had not been written for court. Curtain_nudge, TV_die, knife_insert. The last did not control a blade, not directly. It controlled the local overlay from 612, where a close shot of a gloved hand and a clean edge had been prepared to lay down on top of the feed from 404. I recognized the frame. I had seen it find its mark in the mirror while Kareem lay breathing a thin, obedient breath across the shaft. Rami's script would have sent the insert signal at 11:12 and, if the other conditions were met, would have transmitted the composite to a drop folder with a timestamp readable by a judge. It was cruel and clever. Men who cannot bring themselves to touch blood will invent machines to hold knives for them. Who else knows? I asked. He considered the question for politeness. Then he did not answer. The inspector did not push. Instead, he reached for his phone to give the arrest instruction to the constable in the corridor. Rami watched the motion, and for the first time a tremor passed through his calm. Not fear. Irritation, the way a man looks when a calculation refuses to simplify at the last line. On the desk, under the ledger, an envelope lay with the lid not completely glued. The corner showed a bank logo and an amount written in numbers small enough to avoid scandal if discovered by a curious cleaner. I slid it out with a fingertip and photographed it as the inspector called for a second unit and for Samir to cut power to a particular rack on the conference floor. Samir answered that he could do it in 30 seconds if told which breaker belonged to which friend. Rami let his eyes drift to the laptop again. His hand moved not to the keyboard but to the cooling fan at the side. He knew, as men like him always know, that touching what is obvious can be made to look like a harmless habit while touching what matters lives under that cover. The inspector noticed the motion and stepped around the table to place one palm on the lid of the machine. He said the words with which many arrests begin in this city, and he said them in a tone that preserved dignity even where none had been shown. When his name hit the air with the word charge beside it, something small and thin clicked inside the laptop. The script window brightened. A pop-up that looked like a harmless update request slid over the controls, then dissolved into a red line of text the length of a throat. Failsafe engaged. Loop execution at next window. 11:12 on buffer clock. Rami did not smile, but the corner of his mouth suggested the satisfaction of a man whose contingency plans have learned to walk without him. He said he had assumed his own removal. He had told the system to proceed if his login dropped out under duress. The loop would run at the next alignment of the 13-minute chain. It would push the insert, kill the television, nudge the curtain, and ship the composite to the folder the police scanner watched. The room would act like the vision required, and the vision would help the room. Elegant, he said without saying it. The inspector did not look at the screen. He looked at me. Break the loop, he said. His voice carried no theater. He might have been asking me to hold a door. Samir spoke into his radio from somewhere between floors, already naming breakers and clocks. In 404, a medic had found the vein and given Kareem a set of words to return to. In 612, my bag held what the overlay unit needed to breathe. On the roof, the dial sat at 13 and expected to be obeyed. The hotel believed in its superstition because a man in a conference room had written it into policy. Rami held his wrists together and extended them in a gesture so neat it was almost kind. He did not resist when the constable cuffed him. He did not ask for a lawyer. He looked at the ledger as if it should have argued on his behalf. Numbers do not argue. They only keep walking. I took the bag higher on my shoulder. I said I would start at the dial and pull the 13 to 0 if I had to do it with my teeth. The inspector nodded once. He had already turned toward the door when he added, almost as an afterthought, the command that would decide whether this script ended as a morality play or as an obituary. Document everything in continuous time. Make the truth arrive on schedule. Part 10, Breaking the Loop. The stairwell had the dry breath of a pyramid's throat. I took the steps 2 at a time with the bag banging my hip and the rail cold against my palm. My camera rode a sling at my chest. Lens open. Timecode burned into the corner of the frame like a promise. The city outside the fire door pressed its hum through the concrete. Inside the hotel, the clock we had angered began to count in a voice I did not like. Samir's voice came in my ear, small and resolute. He had 3 racks to cut in sequence and a building that hated to be told no. The medic in 404 called out a pulse number that was not beautiful but was alive. Inspector Farouk stayed steady, speaking to Kareem in the plain words a person learns in a household where trouble arrives often and leaves slowly. Stay with me. Breathe with me. Do not do anything heroic. There is time. On the roof, the dishes waited like white flowers in a night garden. The wind brought the smell of dust and old cables. I crossed to the gray box, set the bag down, and filmed the dial before I touched it. 13 sat on its mark with the satisfaction of a superstition that has earned tenure. A scrap of cloth tape carried the notch like a scar. My hand looked smaller than I prefer in the camera's frame. I said the time aloud. I said my name. I said the purpose. I turned the dial. It resisted in a way that felt personal. Some devices are kept obedient by friction and pride. The neural caught the pad of my thumb and argued. I eased pressure, then added it differently, the way you talk to a child who is not wrong but cannot be allowed to run. The pointer slid past 12, past 10, past 5. Each number let go a little of the hotel's breath. At 3, the wind changed sound against the plexiglass. At 1, the dish hummed once, as if clearing its throat. At 0, the hum stopped. The dial looked naked there. I filmed the pointer kissing the 0. I filmed my watch beside it. I filmed my hands away from the device. Down in 402, Samir whispered that the mirror's image had wobbled as a picture does in an old television when the horizontal hold lets go. The glass tried to decide which world it belonged to. It had been trained to prefer the world that obeyed the number 13. With the number gone, it faltered like a man recovering his own name. The overlay that wanted to land at the next window lost its ledger. The script in the conference room searched for a buffer clock and found only the present. I stayed on the roof for a count of 20 in case the device decided to honor a memory instead of a command. Then I pulled the power to the buffer box at the mains. The unit died with a short, tired sound, the kind that makes you forgive it. I filmed the black panel. I filmed the cord in my hand. I filmed the dish holding a direction that no longer mattered. In the stairwell again, my legs argued with the plan. I told them we could complain later. On the landing above the conference floor, the air held a breath of heated dust. Power had been cut to certain racks where ambition sleeps. The little battery boxes kept the corridor cameras and the elevator lobby lenses alive, their red lights steady as eyes in an old painting. Good, I said aloud, and the recorder in my camera accepted the word into the stream where it could live as proof. I stepped into the office behind the concierge desk long enough to swing the bag onto the table and open it for the inspector's record. The switcher from 612 lay quiet. The uninterruptible power pack stared with its small blind face. The folding knife and the blood pump sat like theater students who have learned the audition did not go their way. The inspector put his clock beside them and photographed the lot. He had the medic on speaker. Kareem's breath had learned a rhythm again. The zip ties were cut and placed in a sterile bag. Severed tails coaxed into the mouth of the plastic as if they were venomous. The medic said a transport team was en route. The inspector told him to keep the man breathing and not to teach him any opinions until he had a doctor. I went back to 402 with Samir. The constable at the door looked like a man who has watched a river decide to flow uphill and has decided not to argue. Inside, the glass had become a rectangle again. No tide from ahead pushed against it. The curtains in the room were where Samir had left them, stubbornly open. The television warmed to a morning show glow because the circuit had returned to its simple ethics. The half-silvered pane behind the mirror lay quiet. Nothing to meet, no picture to seduce. I filmed the mirror saying nothing. I filmed the tape on the latch intact. I filmed the corridor camera through the doorway so some future lawyer could not claim these minutes were invented after the fact. The hotel became honest by degrees the way night becomes morning when no one deserves it. Inspector Farouk arrived with the medic's assistant and the smell of adrenaline. He had a line of dust across his sleeve where the floor of 404 had argued with his coat. He did not ask how the dial had felt. He looked at the glass and accepted that it was behaving. He turned to Samir. "Kill the conference floor power again," he said. "Leave only cameras and elevators on battery. Call your security head and tell him that if any breaker flips itself back, he is to stand in front of it and tell it no until we arrive. Tell him to use his whole body if he has to." Samir did not smile. He made the call. Down the hall, the constable who had taken Noura from 612 reported that she was in the office, seated and speaking, with a statement beginning to confess the kind of truths people tell when they would like to keep breathing without police in their coffee for the rest of their lives. She had already said the dial on the roof belonged to her firm's arrogance. She had already said the cut in the mirror belonged to her need to make people choose fear with their own hands. She had not owned the drug in Kareem's arm. She had not owned the failsafe. Those, she said, were the fingerprints of an accountant who loved outcomes more than clients. The inspector sent a second unit to collect Rami from room C with the kind of politeness that handcuffs understand. I watched the mirror and felt something give. It was small, at the edge of the glass, as if trapped like a moth behind a shade. A faint outline looked back that was not mine. A figure at a slant, camera in hand, at the wrong angle for my stance. I stepped left and right. The faint outline did not obey. It remained where it had no right to be. Not now, I told it, and it obeyed in its own time, thinning until the ordinary returned. I did not film that. I should say I could not film that. The camera was already filming. It saw nothing. The lens believes in light and time and gives them only what they deliver. I made a note for myself because the mind's lens sees differently. Later I would bring it up under the heading of residues and leave it there to trouble scholars and priests. We walked the relay chain once like a priest walking a nave, and we did it with the camera running. Cavity, half-silvered pane, swing arm lens, shaft, 404's receiver, scrim and curtain motor, drilled hole for the toggle, the conference closet rack with its unauthorized router, the roof buffer dial now at 0 and dark. The bag on the office table with the switcher and the battery and the theater knife that never met flesh. A continuous tour in real time, a poor man's miracle to save us later from the word alleged. We returned to 404 in time to watch the medic lift Kareem onto the gurney. He looked smaller without his certainty. The lapis ring had been removed and placed in a bag. In the corridor light, it looked like a piece of sky regretting its owner. The inspector checked the man's eyes and nodded once to himself as if an internal clock had started moving again. He told the medic to route to the nearest emergency room and to send him a blood panel as soon as the dark work could be done. In room C, Rami sat cuffed on a chair set at an angle that denied him any sense of dignity, which he would not have valued anyway. He kept his gaze on the laptop as if it might learn to forgive. The inspector read him the charges in a voice as level as a spirit level on a stone. Attempted murder, unlawful surveillance, cyber intrusion, conspiracy in furtherance of a violent crime. Rami listened the way a man listens to rainfall on a corrugated roof. An irritation, not a warning. He said one thing before they took him. You have broken the loop for tonight. You have not broken the habit. He meant the habit of men like him to find the number that makes a room obey and teach the room to love it. He meant the habit of hotels to keep secrets for those who pay to be unseen. The inspector did not answer. He does not discuss philosophy with men who prefer ledgers to people. The mirror in 402 rested at last. The glass looked like glass. We stood in the quiet that follows when a machine stops writing laws for a room. I checked my watch. 11:12 belonged to the past again. The city outside exhaled. Somewhere a siren stitched a seam and let it go. We had pulled the dial to 0, freed the man with proof, arrested the hand behind the script, and filmed the chain with the merciless love cameras offer the world. It was not grace. It was work. It would hold. Part 11, the remnant in the glass. The hotel learned to breathe again. Elevators sighed. The bar tried on laughter and found it fit. We kept our corner of the night small and honest. The constables cycled statements. Samir drafted a memo to management that read like a prayer disguised as policy. Inspector Farouk sank into the office chair the way a soldier sits on a curb between alarms. He did not relax so much as set his vigilance down beside him for a moment. I returned to 402 with the camera out of habit more than hope. The mirror had behaved since we broke the dial. It had the look of a good citizen who has remembered the law. I set the tripod and let the video roll anyway. The room was ordinary enough to make a person superstitious. 10 minutes passed like water. At 11:25 by my camera, the air changed. It did not grow colder all at once. A single degree slipped away and then a fraction more. My forearms felt it, the sensitive skin along the inside where photographers learn whether before thermometers agree. I held a small digital probe close to the frame. The readout dropped by 1.8 degrees Celsius and hovered there as if listening. Then the mirror found a memory it had not been given. Against the glass, faint as a watermark but precise as a stamp, stood my outline at a slight angle, camera to the shoulder, chin tucked. It was not my current stance. I was 3 feet back, squared to the pane, elbows closed. The figure in the afterimage leaned left and a little forward, a posture I had used earlier in the night when I first chased the myrrh scent into the cavity. The afterimage held steady for the length of a held breath. It had no sound and no weight. The lens saw nothing. The camera gave me the room as it was. My eyes gave me a second slide stacked on the first. I stepped aside and the outline did not track me. It belonged to the glass, not to me. I lifted a hand and it refused to imitate. It was a photograph in a stubborn album that had opened itself to the wrong page. The temperature by the frame stayed low for another 30 seconds, then found its way back as if the building had exhaled. The outline thinned as heat returned and light remembered its rules. I stood still until the pane held only the present. Dr. Curry arrived on my second call. Gloves already on, notebook open to a page that had been waiting. I described the drop and the figure without adding a theory. She listened without smiling. She has no appetite for neat narratives when old materials begin to misbehave. Tin and mercury, she said, palm hovering near the seam where the backing meets wood. The Belzoni-era restorers believed a plate could keep a strong image if the scene was bright and the observer patient. They collected stories. Lovers caught twice. Thieves glimpsed in daylight after dark. Memory is a generous lie, but sometimes the chemistry plays along. She tilted her head to the glass the way a listener leans toward a confession. It did not perform again. Glass is prideful when it chooses to be. She said to let the backing cool. Heat and pressure make the layers forget each other for a while. Cooling makes the old bonds remember. She asked for permission to lift a small corner of the paper that lined the back. The inspector, who had returned without sound as he always did, nodded once. We eased the frame as we had before, this time as if handling a body that did not deserve harm. The cavity breathed its old dust and the last sweet nerve of myrrh. Corey slid a bone folder under the backing and raised a rectangle the size of a postcard. The tin mercury amalgam beneath was dull and tender. Along the wood, scratched in a hand that cared more about notches than flourishes, ran a thin line of Italian. The letters had been covered so long their edges were the color of tea. She read aloud, translating softly as she went. A restorer in 1824 had signed his small pride into the frame and left a note to the next patient craftsman. Specchio che ricorda, a mirror that remembers. He had found that a bright figure set at a strong angle could survive in the plate like an aftertaste. He advised caution in rooms where drama lives. The line ended with a date and a name I will not put here because names deserve more than a case file when they have crossed 2 centuries to greet us. Corey looked pleased and tired at once. She took a photograph with scale and wrote the words down twice, once for the file and once for herself. Her smile had sadness in it. Glass is a slow liquid, she said, and memory is a slower one. We pretend the present owns everything it touches. Objects keep their arguments longer than we do. The inspector did not contradict her. He thanked the dead restorer in a murmur that might have been for the living. He asked if any of this changed the charge sheet. Curry shook her head. The rig in the walls had nothing to do with a 19th century superstition. Our human plot sat intact. The afterimage belonged to that thin seam where craft meets folklore and neither apologizes. Samir stepped to the frame and rested one hand on the wood. The temperature at the edge had returned to the room's temper. He did not ask for comfort. He asked for procedure. If we restore this mirror, can we keep its body and remove its mischief? Curry nodded. The half-silvered pane would go. The swing arm lens and its cabling would leave with photographs and signatures. The backing would be repaired. The amalgam shard with the restorer's note would be archived so the story survives in a form that does not wake guests. We set the frame back and let the room return to an ordinary rectangle. I filmed the whole exchange in a continuous line, time code and tone. The afterimage, if you ask my camera, never happened. The probe could testify about the 1.8 degrees. The writing on the wood could go to court with a translator and a conservator as witnesses. The outline that looked like me at 11:25 lived only in 2 human heads and a sentence written down while the night still felt thin. The inspector walked the line of furniture one last time and read out what would go where before sunrise. The switcher, battery, storyboard, knife, and pump to evidence. The buffer box to evidence with the dial locked at 0. The unauthorized router from the conference closet labeled and bagged. The invoices, ledgers, and bar receipts scanned and secured. Noura to a holding room with a tape running. Rami to a van with a constable on either side and a mind that would soon learn what numbers look like when a judge keeps them. He paused and looked at the mirror as if it were a person still deciding which side to take. We file the mechanism, he said. We acknowledge the remainder. We draw a line between them that a reasonable person can follow. Cairo forgives many things. It does not forgive sloppiness with truth. I shut the camera off at last. Silence returned in a comfortable shape. The city outside had slipped into its late-hour voice, lower and kind. From the street came a horn answering another horn like the old exchange of riddles. Far away, a singer tried the top of a line and then let it fall. We had the work behind us and the residue in front of us. The case would walk into mourning with the weight it had earned. A mirror had been taught to lie and had done so obediently until we interrupted its lesson. It had also kept, for the length of a breath, an image of a woman with a camera leaning toward a seam in the world because that is what she knows how to do. The inspector closed his notebook and tapped the cover once, a habit like a punctuation mark. File the mechanism, he said again, softer. Honor the strangeness. Then he stood, and the night moved with him toward the part where consequences begin. Final part, when the glass stops borrowing. Morning found the hotel in the posture of a penitent. Staff moved softly as if language might chip the varnish. The night manager yielded his desk to day shift with a handshake like a confession. The lemon polish made another brave attempt at absolution. It would not have to fight images anymore. We walked the building once more, not to hunt but to count. In the office, the evidence sat in its labeled trays, the switcher dormant as a dead insect, the battery with its tiny stare, the storyboard trimmed of power by the day. Noura sat across from a tape recorder and answered in the measured cadence of someone who has decided words will serve her better than silence. She laid out her theater without poetry, extortion by suggestion, an overlay to make fear persuasive, no cut beyond the page. She signed where the inspector placed his finger and did not look angry so much as deprived of a good line. In holding, Rami Mahfouz waited behind a metal table and tried to arrange his hands in a way that would make mathematics take his side. It refused. The charges presented themselves in tidy order. Attempted murder by means of premeditated manipulation, unlawful surveillance, cyber intrusion, conspiracy to commit a violent crime. He listened without blinking. When the officer paused for breath, he asked if the court would accept ledger copies to understand the motive. The officer wrote that down too. Motive enjoys paper. Still weighs less than blood. Karim woke briefly under hospital lights and tried to locate his ring before he located himself. A nurse told him that objects had gone to evidence and that he would keep his breath if he followed orders for once. The inspector stood at the foot of the bed and watched the realization happen in Karim's face like weather traveling across a domed ceiling. The charges for trafficking and fraud would arrive with daytime and be served with that clean efficiency bureaucracies reserved for the familiar sins of commerce. Karim nodded as if numbers could be bargained with. He has the look of men who always expect to find a back door, even in institutions that do not have them. The hotel kept its promises. Samir convened a meeting that included engineering, housekeeping, security, and a representative from a law firm that had made a life out of untangling other people's wire. The redundant trunk was mapped and made honest. The unauthorized router left the building in a box with a chain of signatures. The maintenance ledger gained a page titled Practices That Never Again. The page included a line about gratitude as blindfold. It will be read aloud every year to new hires who think stories like last night are exaggerated by old men. In room 402, we took the mirror down a final time. It came quietly, as if relieved to be asked to behave like itself. The half-silvered pane was removed, photographed, and wrapped. The swing arm lens followed, its collar dusted and its fingerprints numbered. A technician slid blank plates into the cavity where cable had once carried superstition. The frame went back onto a wall that now held nothing but its own duty. If a person breathed on the glass, it fogged, and if a person lifted a hand, the glass returned it without delay or narrative. Dr. Layla Khoury oversaw the work with a restorer's gentleness. She lifted the small rectangle of backing where the Italian hand had signed itself to the wood and separated an amalgam shard that held the words in place. She catalogued the piece, wrapped it in paper that made very little noise, and wrote a pair of statements. One for the record, one for the museum that would keep it safely. She kept nothing for herself except the smile that scholars wear when the world admits it has a memory long enough to include them. I filed my report with the photographs and the continuous time video and the transcript that followed the slow breath of the night. I wrote the line as I had heard it in my chest when the dial moved to 0. A mirror can be taught to lie, but truth is brighter when it arrives on time. It was not poetry. It was inventory. The inspector read it, nodded once, and placed the page near the top where prosecutors prefer to find usable sentences. Cairo resumed itself with the seriousness of a city that has work to do. The minarets kept time. The fruit sellers arranged pyramids of color on carts like small arguments with entropy. The traffic on Talat Harb returned to its old negotiation. Horn against horn, impatience against charm. The hotel lobby found its gloss again. Guests stepped over the boundary between outside and inside and accepted the fiction hotel's offer. Inside is simpler. Before we left, Samir walked me to 402 and stood with his hand on the door frame. He did not ask if the room was clean. He asked if a person could sleep here without adopting someone else's dream. I told him yes, I believe it. He nodded and let out a breath that had been holding for longer than he would admit. He loves his building. It had tried to complicate his love. He was gonna love it anyway. Inspector Farouk gathered us near the desk and closed his notebook. He thanked Samir by name and not by title. He thanked the constables for not letting procedure develop a personality bigger than the law. He told me to go home and sleep and to call him if the frame breathed again when no one was touching it. Then he put on his coat and walked through the morning haze into a city where mirrors do their job and men sometimes do not. We gave the night to the archive. Somnolent Conspiracies signed off on the case file with the respect you reserve for a tool that nearly learned how to become an accomplice. The mirror no longer borrowed minutes from the future. The hotel did not either. The present, imperfect and sufficient, would have to do. That evening, the lobby lights wrote themselves across the polished floor and then climbed the columns in narrow ladders of gold. A child ran his fingers along the seam of the wall where the frame meets plaster and found nothing to excite a story. Upstairs, a guest checked the room one last time before dinner and saw her face come back at once when she leaned toward the glass. She smiled, unafraid of what it might know tomorrow. The mirror answered with the honesty of a pain that has had its theater stripped and its pride restored. I walked out to Talat Harb and let the air decide which hand to hold. Cars slid by in threads of white and red. Somewhere a radio gave a game to the street with the ease of a man trying to turn his luck with noise. Cairo looked like a city that trusts glass again. I prefer it that way. We all deserve to meet our reflections on time. End of story. And that was the room that borrowed tomorrow. A story about how light can lie, how mirrors can learn habits, and how truth sometimes arrives only when someone dares to drag the dial back to 0. Here, in the city that never quite sleeps, we found a reflection that wanted to borrow the future, and the people who almost let it. A photographer who still believed in proof. A detective who spoke to ghosts like witnesses. And a pane of glass that remembered too much. Thank you for walking every dark corridor with us. For listening to the hum of old electricity. For watching the night give back its secrets minute by minute. If you've stayed until this breath, then you already know how our stories work. The mystery ends, but the echo keeps talking. So, until the next investigation, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a light on, just bright enough for the next truth to find you. Somnolent Conspiracies signs off from Cairo, where even the mirrors sleep on time.